So, what happens when the 911 system designed to save your life decides your immediate emergency is just a minor nuisance?
That is the dangerous um, policy tightrope that cities are walking right now.
And we just saw the consequences.
We really did in Malba, Queens. It's an incident that just, it lays bare this severity gap, a gap created when these public safety systems get restructured to prioritize, well, something other than the immediate threat.
We have to start there because that incident was just catastrophic. I mean, this wasn't a noise complaint.
Not even close.
This was an egregious act of violence. The reports detail a coordinated street takeover in a quiet residential neighborhood. We're talking about a violent mob, something like 40 vehicles, cars doing donuts.
Then they set a car on fire, intentionally.
Right. And in the middle of all that chaos, citizens who were terrified, who were calling 911 for an immediate armed response, what were they told?
Well, allegedly they were told that the situation should be handled by and this is a quote, the quality of life team.
The quality of life team.
In 311, a non-emergency system. While a couple was reportedly being brutally attacked, we're talking broken bones, broken nose, shoulder, ribs. I mean, real immediate physical harm was happening.
So the system just failed to recognize an imminent high-threat crisis, one that required maximum force.
Absolutely. And you had local councilwoman Vicky Palladino who called the whole thing unacceptable.
As she should.
She argued that these violent, organized takeovers, they require, in her words, the maximum force by the police department.
And that tension is really the core of our deep dive today.
It is. That tension between the need for a decisive, rapid response and this policy push to divert police resources away from that.
So our mission is to unpack the data that led to these alternative response systems and really investigate the risk when those systems get it wrong, when they prioritize managing minor disorder over stopping genuine violence.
We're going through the source material you, the learner, provided on how these triage mechanisms are failing when the stakes are literally life and death.
Okay, so let's unpack that policy push. To get why cities are trying so hard to route calls away from police, we have to look at the stats. What does the data actually tell us police spend most of their time doing?
The data is really, really influential here. There was an analysis across 9 major U.S. cities, New York, Seattle, Detroit, among them.
Okay.
And it reveals a pretty staggering trend. Police are overwhelmingly tasked with non-criminal issues, things that, don't require an officer trained and equipped for force.
Give us the numbers. What are the policy analysts looking at to justify these shifts?
Okay, so the majority of 911 calls across those 9 cities, an average of 62.6% involve situations classified as non-criminal.
62%. So more than 6 out of every 10 calls are for things like, what, neighbor disputes?
Exactly. Social disputes, checking on people, mental health episodes, minor disturbances. It's an efficiency nightmare if you're trying to manage a police department.
And what about the really serious stuff, the violent crime?
That's where the number shrinks dramatically. When you look at calls for homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault. For 6 of the 9 cities studied, no more than 3% of all 911 calls involve those crimes.
Wait, only 3%?
Just 3%.
So here's where the argument for alternatives gets really interesting, because the workload, that huge 62%, involves social issues that, maybe officers aren't the best people to resolve. So the policy conclusion is to send unarmed civilian responders instead.
It's presented as a sensible rebalancing of resources, but the data also showed a massive over-reliance on traditional police, despite that tiny 3% slice of violent crime.
And they were still being sent to everything.
Up to 88% of all 911 calls in 4 of the sample cities. It just shows decades of inertia where police became the default for everything.
So the impulse to fix that is understandable. But here's the question. If the main focus is diverting resources to handle that 62%, are we systematically reducing the capacity to handle the sudden extreme violence in that 3%?
That is the ultimate trade-off.
It feels like we're engineering a system that's optimized for the mundane, and it risks failing in the truly critical moment.
And that's the core debate. Optimizing for efficiency versus guaranteeing decisive action for the outlier crisis. From a law and order perspective, the system's primary job is protecting the innocent from harm. That capacity has to remain, no matter what the call volume says.
Before we circle back to Malba, we need to understand why city leaders are so focused on these lower-level issues. This gets us to the theory behind it all, right? The broken windows theory.
Yeah, that's essential context. Broken windows theory is from back in 1982. It basically argues that if you let minor signs of disorder, fester, graffiti, loitering, trash, It sends a signal.
A signal that no one cares.
Exactly. And that perceived lack of oversight encourages more minor stuff, and then eventually more serious crime. The idea that disorder breeds chaos.
And historically, this theory worked, didn't it? I mean, in New York in the 90s, policies targeting petty offenses correlated with these huge drops in both petty and serious crime.
It wasn't just anecdotal. A 2015 meta-analysis found that disorder policing leads to, quote, consistent crime reduction effects. For a lot of people, this isn't just about cleaning up streets. It's a real strategy to stop violence before it starts.
Which brings us to the modern version, these Q teams, the NYPD's Quality of Life Division.
Right, and Commissioner Tisch was clear, this isn't zero tolerance. The goal is to improve daily life, to confront the issues that chip away at people's sense of safety.
Because most people aren't victims of major crime.
But they do experience their neighborhood breaking down every single day.
So the Q teams are focused on that visible disorder. Illegal vending, abandoned cars, open-air drug use, all of it. And they're getting results, right?
They are. I mean, the numbers are measurable. In their pilot commands, the Q teams responded to over 7,500 complaints from 9/11 and 311 in just 2 months.
And they cut response times.
They did. They cut non-emergency response times by an average of 16 minutes. They towed nearly 3,500 abandoned vehicles. They're delivering on what they were designed to do.
And here is the critical irony. The Q teams are succeeding. They're addressing the non-emergency issues that make up most of the calls.
What?
But is it possible that this very success, this intense focus on the feeling of safety, created a fatal flaw in the triage system? A flaw that makes it default to diversion even when faced with extreme violence?
That is the exact vulnerability. When you shift resources and train people to prioritize diversion for non-crime matters, the 911 dispatchers, the human firewall, are trained to look for ways to route the call to a non-police entity.
The system becomes primed to divert.
Not to deploy maximum force.
Which brings us right back to Malba, Queens, a scenario that explicitly required police. A coordinated mob, arson, people being physically hurt.
And the system defaulted to the non-emergency model. The triage failure was absolute.
Calling 911, the emergency line, and being told to call 311.
It's not just a slow response. It's a systemic misclassification of an imminent violent threat as if it were just disorder.
And it highlights the need for actual police power. A quality of life team can't stop a mob setting a car on fire. They can't.
They have zero capacity for that. Only police are empowered to use force, to make arrests, to restore order in that kind of situation. Diverting that call is basically abandoning the victims.
And there are legal risks here too, right? For the city.
Huge ones. If we connect this to the legal context, 911 dispatchers usually have limited immunity, but that protection can disappear if they fail to follow prescribed guidelines in their, what are called their ministerial duties.
Ministerial duties. Can you break that down?
Sure. Think of cases like Masachi v. AHL services. The courts basically say the 911 operators have a duty to accurately record and classify the emergency. If new policies incentivize them to misclassify a violent incident as a quality of life issue.
To meet some kind of diversion goal.
Exactly. And that misclassification leads to a delayed response and someone gets hurt, well, the city or the dispatcher could be exposed to liability for negligence.
So, by training operators to default toward diversion, you might be creating a higher risk of negligence in that critical 3% of calls, the ones that absolutely cannot be diverted.
Precisely. The consequence isn't just a political problem, it's a legal and physical danger. The Malba incident confirms that public safety relies on an unwavering commitment to rapid response for high-threat events.
And that policy confusion is putting ideology ahead of law and order.
That's how some see it. It's about what happens when the system fails to distinguish between minor disorder and an imminent threat to people's lives or bodily safety.
So let's wrap this up. What does it all mean? The data shows there's an opportunity to use non-police alternatives for non-criminal issues. That makes sense for the 62% of calls. The Q teams are helping.
But the danger is in creating an institutional blind spot. The focus on restoring order can't come at the expense of maintaining the immediate, overwhelming capacity to counter violence.
The primary mission has to be protecting life and property.
It has to be.
So as you, the learner, analyze these public safety reforms, you have to remember that resource allocation is a zero-sum game here.
It is. Every dollar, every minute, and every dispatch protocol shifted away from traditional enforcement carries a risk for when that capacity is urgently needed. The key takeaway is pretty simple. The system has to be designed for decisive intervention in that 3% of violent calls.
not just for efficient management of the other 62%.
Right.
We know that police in those cities were dispatched to up to 88% of calls. If these alternative systems become the permanent default, how many violent incidents like the Malba Street takeover, that critical, non-negotiable 3%, will be wrongly routed before the system corrects its priorities? The ultimate measure of public safety isn't how quiet the streets are, it's how quickly and decisively the system responds when the unthinkable truly happens.